Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. I'm excited to have Tori Haschka joining me today. Hi Tori.
Hello.
And also wanting to mention having you back again. It's good to have authors back again.
It is a delight to come back. The second book baby.
So Tori's latest book is a recipe for family. I can see your copy. What? Look how mine's
Oh,
got. Oh yeah, there we go.
there we go.
So, just a little bit about Tori for those who don't know her or haven't met her in our group before. Tori's a published cookbook author and has appeared on the Today Show, Adam Lou's The Cook Up, and ABC Radio. She has also written for Grazier, The Times, Mother and Baby, Mamma Mia, the Sydney Morning Herald, and Mother and Baby, and The Guardian. Her first book, Grace Under Pressure, was released in 2021, and she lives in Berry with her husband and two children. And as I said, her latest book is the recipe for a recipe for family. And thanks to DMCPR. If you ask a question during the Facebook Live, you'll have a chance to win a copy of her book. So thanks so much again for joining us. Would you like to start off by telling us a bit about a recipe for family?
Yeah, absolutely. A Recipe for Family continues the world that I established in Grace Under Pressure, which was my first novel. And this is a story of mothers, of au pairs, of compromises, and of comfort food. And it's an intergenerational story of three women. Stella, who's a working mother who is desperately trying to keep her head above water. Elise, who's her feminist mother-in-law, and Ava, who is a 19-year-old American au pair that they bring into the family in a desperate sort of Hail Mary pass in
Mm,
order to be able to make their lives a bit more manageable. And what it does is it really explores the idea that, they say that you can't buy family, but can you rent it? So, what happens to this group of women when they, are divided by assumptions and they are, are faced with a bit of a comedy of manners of trying to
mm.
get along with each other in some fairly ethically murky circumstances, and how food ultimately can bring them together.
Yeah, and I love how you have the recipes and all that all mixed in your book, and then at the end, you've got the recipes for
Yes,
people, which is
yes.
great.
Well, food fiction is sort of a happy place for me
Mm,
because, as you said, Jackie, my background is as a food writer beforehand, and so food is, and I'm a feeder as a person.
yeah,
This is how I make friends with people. This is how that's my act of service. But the food fiction also combines, two of the great pleasures for me, which is a
mm,
great meal and a good book. And so
mm,
I find that if I can put them together, then that makes, work a lot more fun for me. And I also think that food gives us an entry point for metaphor, and food also sometimes says things that we don't quite know how to put into words. So that was what I really wanted to, chew into in this book.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great mixture, and lots of interesting things I'd say happen throughout the book as well, don't they?
Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that I really wanted to explore in A Recipe for Family is, you know, um, is just the small mistakes that we make every day and
Mm,
how they can spiral when we are trying to do our best, and how, particularly women, when they're faced with impossible circumstances, um, and the impossible circumstances are being asked by the world to do sort of two or three jobs at the
yeah.
same time,
Mm,
how they are forced to optimize their relationships, whether it's, bringing in 19-year-olds as surrogate parents, or whether
mm.
they're being conscripted into pyramid schemes in the holy grail of, can you have flexible work that you can do from home, or how, whether you accidentally sell out your friends in order to climb up a social ladder.
Yeah.
So those were, once I started making a list of, what are the ethical pitfalls that you can fall into when trying to get things right, there was a very long list
Mm,
of potential
yeah.
circumstances to choose from.
Yeah. So, were there a few things that didn't make the book?
There were actually, and this book had a really checkered, um, production timeline for
Mm,
it. And I think, from any of the authors that you've spoken to, particularly the women who have been creating content in the last 2 or 3 years with school-age children at home, these have not been the easiest years in which to be creative or productive. And so I was stuck in an interesting situation where, we published Grace Under Pressure, and I'd signed on a deal with Simon & Schuster to produce the second book, and I wanted to be able to capitalise on that early interest that had come from Grace. So that characters from Grace turn up in the background of A Recipe for Family, and then Stella, who's the protagonist of A Recipe for Family, is threaded into the background of Grace Under Pressure. And in Grace, she's not a particularly likable character. She's Grace's quite, precious boss for it. And what I really wanted to get into was, you see people sometimes in a professional setting, but that's only one side of them. What is life like once they go home? What is the rest of their, universe like? And I wanted to sort of explore what is it that makes Stella, so paranoid, so prickly and so precious in Grace Under Pressure. And Stella's paranoid and prickly and precious, but also has some very redeeming characteristics to her, because of what has been the responsibilities that have been placed upon her. She's a stepmother to a very challenging 14-year-old. She's a mother to a 4-year-old who is relentless. Any of us who've had 4-year-olds who are relentless might be able to, relate to that. But so those were the storylines that I wanted to sort of keep being able to explore. But we had this timeline of, suddenly you're having to write while the world is also asking us to do pretty extraordinary things. And so the first draft of A Recipe for Family was written largely in the first lockdown of 2020. And I then handed it in at the end of the year. And there was a fourth character strand that was weaved through it. So in the book, as you see it now, there's Stella, who's the working mother. There's Elise, her mother-in-law. There's Ava, the au pair. And there was a fourth voice originally in there, which was Tara, which is Stella's best friend. And once I handed that in, I got these, fairly, clear notes back from the publishers that there were changes that needed to be made, and they're great notes that came back. But it was so funny because they turned to me, in that first year when we were all trying to work, I was working from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m. and I'd set an alarm in my room, and I'd had a kettle set up next to me so I wouldn't wake the children, and I'd be able to write before they woke up, and then I'd be educating and looking after them, and then I'd put them on screens for an hour in the afternoon. I'd do a little bit more work then, and then I'd work at night once they went to bed. But we were all, stressed and frayed and exhausted, and the notes that I got back from the publishers was that the women in the book were just a little bit angry.
Okay.
And it wasn't that nice to read because the women were very angry, which just made me think, well, so it was very much like, when you're cooking and you're making, a braise and you cook it hard and fast because you're in a bad mood and it comes out tasting bad.
Yeah.
And that book came out tasting quite bad because I wrote it in circumstances that just weren't tenable.
Yeah.
And so in the year that came, we pulled out Tara's voice, and there were other aspects of the books that I really, was able to delve further into rather than sort of the social politics of it all. And sort of, Tara had a grab bag of other, issues that would be familiar to mothers. But we were able to lean into some of the softer content of the book, which I think has made it much more comforting to read, which is, the comfort food recipes that are inherited. So Ava, who is the 19-year-old au pair, travels to Australia from America after the loss of her own mother with a packet of recipes with her. And each of those recipes come with lessons for life to them. So a mother is sort of prepared ahead of time. And so they're recipes to make, when she is sad and when she is lonely. And they're sort of almost prescriptions for mood instead. So I leaned much further into sort of that content. And then the other aspect of the book that was bumped up in the wake of that was Elise and Elise's romance in it. And I haven't really written a romance plotline before, and I got a bit of flack in Grace Under Pressure that the men weren't very nice, the men weren't very likable. So I thought, all right, well, let's write a redeeming male character. And Jock, I think, is fantastic because he really fulfills the adage of, sometimes the sexiest thing that a man can ever ask a woman is, how can I help?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, and so
That's very true.
that's what he does. That's what he does. He turns up, and is his act of redemption for knowing that he's mucked up years and years earlier, as he turns up and he just asks, he tries to seduce her through acts of service of cooking for her and helping around the house and asking, how can I help?
Well, we've got lots of people watching. Oh, excuse me. So just wanted to say, if you're watching, please type a question for Tori in comments and I can read it out and you'll have a chance to win a copy of A Recipe for Family. Thanks to DMCPR. Just wondering, what was the first idea you had for A Recipe for Family?
Well, that recipe, the real jumping off point for this was that ethical murkiness of au pairs.
Yeah,
And
okay.
for anyone who's not familiar with what an au pair is, it's sort of, the direct translation of it is au pair is equal to. So they're supposed to be equal to family. And traditionally, they're sort of 19 to sort of 21-year-old, young girls primarily who come and they join a family for a period of time. And it's there as sort of half exchange student, half domestic assistant, half nanny, but it is this incredibly grey area of potential exploitation and unmet expectations where, you're asking somebody to step into a role of quasi-parent, of assistant for it, when, at 19, you are so unqualified for that sort of responsibility. And it's also this sense of, are you family? Are you not? When the relationship works well, it's glorious. When the relationship does not work well, it is, poisonous. And the stories that I heard, from my ear to the ground of the exploitation that happened, was really pretty gobsmacking. So I thought that was such an interesting phenomenon of, these are people who are desperately trying, and au pairs have with it sort of this sniffy sort of harbinger of privilege, that it's, but really a lot of people who are resorting to au pairs as childcare assistants don't have family around. So they don't have that traditional notion of the village to be able to rely on. They're either working shift work and, there isn't other childcare options available in the middle of the night, or they're living in a childcare desert in a rural or region area where there isn't that much daycare facilities or, early childhood education around. And for me, I had my own, personal experience with an au pair for 9 months where I had a spouse who was living overseas, not living overseas, but was traveling overseas for sort of, large chunks of time. And I had 2 children, one of whom had chronic asthma and croup, and frequently over winter needed to be taken to hospital over the middle of the night. And after 2 instances of having to wake up the baby to take the baby with us to hospital and carrying 2 children into emergency room at the same time, I just realised that I needed another, breathing adult in the house overnight. And so, and our experiences with our au pair were largely, an incredibly positive one, but there is so much potential for misunderstanding, both from a generational point of view. I think there's a lot about 19-year-olds that is foreign to those of us who haven't lived with one before or who aren't 19 anymore, and also cross-culturally, the directness of other cultures, of American culture and their communication standards versus what Australians are. There's just so much potential for confusion and misinterpretation and hurt. And so I really wanted to chew into some of that. So the au pair was the jumping off point. But the other thing that I really wanted to explore was this idea of, like, what is work, And so much of who we are and our sense of identity comes from what we do. And when you are given job upon job upon job, whether it is, care responsibilities for parents and for children and for stepchildren and for the other women in your life, and you're trying to balance that with care for yourself and the stripping of identity that comes with motherhood, like, what happens in those sort of very gritty, milky years of early motherhood, and how do women lean on each other and mother each other in order to get through? But the food thing was also interesting in A Recipe for Family, because I wrote a lot about food in Grace Under Pressure, because Grace, the protagonist there, she was a food writer as well. But the food that Grace wrote about was the food of wellness, and was this cult of wellness. And food was much more of a point of anxiety, and it was about how do you, in this sense of like having to be good, and how do we be perfect, and what the pressures that we put on ourselves. And I really wanted to step away from that. And I think the last couple of years have shown us that, when times are tough, there are certain foods that we turn to for comfort.
Yeah.
And they are not quinoa salads,
Exactly.
And so, and the idea of, the tastes that we inherit from our mothers, and what that sort of that joy and comfort can bring to us when we are feeling lost and alone. And so a lot of the recipes that are in this book are also the ones that, that we were all making, when we were locked in our homes. So there's banana breads, and there's pelmeni dumplings, which are sort of like the Eastern European cousin of a soup dumpling and a ravioli. And there's, really comforting dals, and there are, and there are funfetti cake. There were all the things that we were making at home when the world outside our front doors was very scary.
And I think now that you mention the dumplings, am I right in remembering I saw you on TV making?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I had a
What
great
was
time.
that on?
Oh, I got to go into the morning show.
Oh,
and
yes,
with Larry O'Hare and Kyla Gillis, and that was great. That was great fun. It was great fun. And I think they were, they enjoyed it, and I think it's a great thing, particularly with school holidays coming up as well. To be able to pass the time with a group of friends and other children, and so what Ava talks about in the book as well is pelmeni parties, which is sort of a notion that her mother passes down to her, which is that, when you want to gather a group of people together, it's a very easy way to pass time and to end up with something productive at the end of it. So you make the dough and you roll them, and then you stuff them, and then you freeze them or you eat them. And what you're left with is this, delightful bowl of sort of carbohydrates and mince, and you put sort of brown butter and sour cream and paprika over the top of it, and it is really one of the most comforting bowls of food that I know of.
Yeah, it looked great when I saw you making them. They looked really
we
great.
had a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we've got quite a few people watching, so just reminding, if you do have any questions, please type them in comments. I've got a few questions from people. Belinda, she says she's loved both of your books and loves the recipes.
Thank you, Belinda. That's very lovely to hear.
Polly says she totally gets what you're saying about young children and 4-year-olds. Her son's turning 4 tomorrow.
4 is, everybody talks about 2 and 3 being hard, but I think 4 is just, 4 is a whole other level.
Yeah. And Sharon wonders how much research you did for the book. I'm wondering if a lot is from experience as well.
Yeah, apart from the action research of having our own au pair for 9 months, and I also, made sure, I heard a lot of stories through our au pair and through her friends of some of the circumstances that go on behind closed doors. And
what country was your au pair from?
She was American. She was from she was American, and she had sort of a lot of au pair friends that were either Canadian or French, etc. And there's a lot of privilege on the northern beaches of Sydney, and there are a lot of private school educated men who are not behaving as well as they should be. So we'll just leave it at that. But
I can imagine.
In terms of the rest of the research, one of the other, I've always it's a trope that's in both of the books for it, which is the but the Beaches Mothers Facebook page, which operates in Grace Under Pressure and is introduced there as sort of Christine refers to it as a Greek chorus that can touch time, and it's there as a way of foreshadowing the action and as a source of humor and levity, but is, anybody who's ever been a parent in a digital age will be quite familiar with the phenomenon of sort of local area mothers Facebook groups, and how they are they're sort of a bellwether for the anxieties of the time. If you want to know what mothers are worried about, You go and have a look on those pages,
Yeah.
and you will very quickly find out what the concerns of local mothers are. And, you know, I think it's just been cultural absorption from 10 years of parenting now, of seeing all of those and realizing how essential those digital villages are, particularly when we weren't able to access our friends, you know, in real time. But also how they can be tools in which they can either build people up or drag them down. And so they're always fun things to write in the books, and they're something that, you know, in terms of the research, you know, I spend a lot of time, you know, in an anthropological sort of guise, on a variety of pages, you know, because I now have moved to sort of regional New South Wales, and because I've lived in a variety of places. And it's funny how the geography also really impacts sort of the topics and the priorities of those Facebook groups. And so I really hope that those Facebook group pages are seen by people as, you know, as written with love and affection, and it's sort of loving satire of it. But it's also, you know, in this book, what they do is they foreshadow the drama, and not only the drama in the book, but they foreshadow what the concerns of the women are going to be once the book ends. Because one of the real sort of conundrums, I think, for anybody who's been writing fiction in the last couple of years is how do we actually write contemporary fiction about a time which nobody wants to read about at all? I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I am not ready to read a book necessarily that's been set in COVID times. You know, and there are a couple of people who've done it brilliantly, and Holly Wainwright in The Couple Upstairs has managed it spectacularly. But Holly's done it by using it to set a mood of sort of eerie discomfort that sort of really plays into the plot line. But for me, I think there's a great thing that people talk about when they're talking about but autobiography, which is that you don't write from open wounds. You only write from scars. And, you know, for many of us, I think we're still bleeding from the last couple of years. And I was not ready to write a book about, you know, about pandemic times. Partly it didn't also fit because there were no au pairs.
Yeah.
You know, they were all sent home. None of them were here.
Yeah.
So I was faced with this conundrum of like, how do you manage this book? And so we specifically said it in 2019, the year before the pandemic. But those Facebook pages set up, if you go through them, and each of the concerns which are listed for them are then going to become very prescient for the women in the years to come. They're about contagion. They're about paranoia about contagion. They're about people not following rules that they think that they should. They're about how do you manage, you know, the competing demands of domestic work and child rearing and your job at the same time. You know, and if the women were struggling to do that in 2019, when, you know, villages of other women were available for support outside the home, when childcare was available for them, when there were schools that were available for them, you know, if those women were struggling to do that, then imagine how they're going to cope, you know, come 2020. And that was the only way that I could intellectually wrap my head around, you know, how do we write about this without directly writing about it? So, you know, and then the ending of the book, you know, has a little special, you know, twist in the tail. Twist in the tail for the women of what's going to come. But that was, so in terms of the research, you know, a lot of it is, you know, and people who write contemporary women's fiction, you know, we don't publish our diaries. It's not all true, but we certainly do lean on, you know, our experiences, and we try and be what we call good art friends, where, you know, I will ask friends of mine for permission to, you know, if something spectacular happens, and I'll be like, can I use that?
Yeah.
Can I use that? And so there are things that are certainly peppered throughout the books that, you know, are real lived experience. And I think that, you know, maybe helps the books really land for some people, because they can see themselves and they can see the lived experiences of their friends in it.
And do you think you will ever write about COVID times, and maybe we will see how these women coped when?
I don't know. One of the things that that is interesting to me, and I might start to explore, is you know, you and I were talking earlier, Jackie, and I got COVID in January before I had to finish the final edits of this book, and so I had to do the final edits of it and got COVID very badly, and then ended up with sort of long COVID afterwards, which took, brain fog comes with that, chronic migraine, etc. So I am definitely in the debt of my publisher, Castabello, and the rest of the team at Simon & Schuster who helped me with the proofreading process of it, because the brain fog is spectacular, where you get to the point where you get name blindness as part of it. And so people would be asking, they'd be like, can you just double check if Amber has 2 children or 3 children? I'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no idea. So I had to develop this enormous spreadsheet of keeping track of who all of these women were in this fictional universe and how many children they had and how they related to each other, to keep track of it all. But one of the things that I also experienced was, luckily it came back, but there was a period of time where I lost my sense of taste and smell post-COVID. And for a food writer, that's a very distinct experience. So, I might like to write about some of that, but I think it'll take me a while, to be able to write with good humor about really what went on in those 2 years. And I wrote the angry draft of it, and we put that aside. But I think I dedicated the book to the pandemic mothers, because I really think that there were pretty extraordinary acts of valor that were done largely by women with school-age children in those years, who were educating kids at home, who were trying to keep their own jobs going, and what the sacrifices that they made in order to keep the rest of the community safe is pretty extraordinary, really. And now we're supposed to just roll on and be like, oh well, that happened, let's move on.
And what are you working on now?
So I've got back into at the moment I'm really enjoying my cooking again. And so I'm back into developing a whole batch of recipes, and I don't quite know where they're going to find their way into, but I'm working on that, and I am exploring this idea of of what our sense memories and our taste memories are, and how do we connect to those. I'm not sure if I have a feeling that the women of the Northern Beaches, that universe is probably been set aside for a little bit. I'm not sure how much more I really have to say about that. It might come to me, but I do feel like the gamut of experiences between postnatal anxiety and the way that women lean on alcohol and questionable things to cope. I think that there's a lot of issues that were top of mind for me that I have been explored in both books. So I don't know, it might be fun to lean into something that's a bit lighter for a while. Maybe even a bit more of a romance might be fun. I could do with one of those.
And what have you been doing to promote A Recipe for Family? I think Grace Under Fire came out more during lockdown, didn't it? So you wouldn't have had as much in-person promotion.
Grace Under Pressure came out, and we did a couple of events for it, but it was largely locked down for it. So it's been lovely to get out and about. So I've been doing quite a lot of book clubs, which is delightful, and it's a really great one for book clubs as well. We've got the questions.
It's great when you have questions at the back.
I mean, we know that everybody's busy. Nobody really, if we can do anything that's going to make life easier for women, let's do it. So we've got cheats, questions in the back, we've got recipes there, and it also opens up, I think, the book, a lot of good questions to chew over. There is a lot of, everybody's got an experience with a pyramid scheme or a multi-level marketing thing of a friend who they thought was a friend who's tried to rope them into, a pyramid scheme, and how that poisons the relationship. Everybody's got a story of, somebody who was an au pair or had an au pair and what happened. And even if there's not that, then, everybody remembers the story of, Jude Law and Ben Affleck with the nannies. And, that's a tale as old as time. And then there is also sort of a group therapy aspect of it, where the book does give you the opportunity to then talk about, what are some of the coping mechanisms that we use when times are tough? How healthy are they? How problematic are they? And then the other thing that's really lovely in it is that it does give you an opportunity to be able to talk about what are the recipes that have come from our mothers or our grandmothers, and or by the same token, what are the foods that we make for our own children or nieces or nephews or you know, or the women in our life that we hope that they will associate with us. You know, I asked my kids the other day, and I was like what are the foods that mum cooks that you think of, you know, is mum? And for my daughter, it's, you know, it's chicken schnitzel, and whenever we make schnitzel, you know, that's, you know, she's like, schnitzel is mummy food. And I'm like, well, that's lovely. That comes from the family heritage. And for my son, it's the pesto recipe that's in the back of the book.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, you know, and he and I have a routine now where we make that together once a week, and he helps.
Nice.
And then it's sort of, you know, so, you know, if calamity was to befall me, then, you know, the pesto recipe would be one that he, you know, at 9 has got locked into his subconscious, and that he would know that is the taste, you know, of his mother. Or, you know, because I think a lot of parenthood inadvertently becomes being a short order cook.
Yeah.
You know, and if you know, and that's a challenge for me. And I'm somebody who loves cooking, and, you know, and this is my passion and delight. But there's a difference between the food that you make out of love and the food that you make for creative exploration, and the food that just has to be like put in a lunchbox, cleared off the table, served after soccer training. You know, so finding ways to reinsert sort of the joy and interest into that, you know, aspect of caretaking was something that was, you know, that was fun. And that's something that book clubs are liking to talk about.
Yeah.
So I've been doing the book clubs for it, and then we've also been going around to a lot of libraries, and then I've spent a bit of time on the road. And last weekend in Canberra, I had a delightful event with Holly Wainwright, who's a good friend of mine. And Holly and I got together and were able to talk to the books. And it was a lovely sort of continuation of a journey for the two of us, because we met when we both moved to the South Coast, and we were working on the books, and we're able to bond on, you know, the challenges of how do you find creative flow at this time when there is no creative flow available for us. And then we both ran away together in January when we were harder upon deadlines, and we just couldn't get any work, like the proper work done that we needed, you know, with the distractions of family life. So we went and ran to a little sort of Airbnb cabin that had virtually no internet. And we took with us, you know, a couple of bottles of wine, a lot of tea and some chocolate, some, you know, and some basic supplies, and locked ourselves in for 2.5 days, and had a great arrangement with each other. You know, you had to write 2,000 words before you were allowed to talk to each other, you know, and you had to write a certain amount, and then you were allowed another cup of tea, et cetera. And so being able to, you know, that thing of finding other women to go on a creative journey with makes it so much easier to do, but also makes it so much lovelier when, you know, the books are birthed, that you then have this other creative, you know, a circle of creative women to be able to celebrate them. So that's been really, really lovely.
Yeah. And have you got a favourite comfort recipe you'd like to share with us?
So the palmini dumplings in the book are definitely one of them. And so, you know, they're sort of Eastern European in origin. I came across them, and they're sort of related distantly to my husband's family's sort of heritage. But I discovered them when I was 6 months pregnant and in New York with my first son, and it was freezing cold, and we were walking around and slipping over black ice everywhere. And the only thing that I craved at the time was just like bowls of carbohydrates and dairy. And that was it. Like, that child was just built on carbohydrates and dairy. And so I discovered sort of these hole-in-the-wall places in the East Village, and it was so bitterly cold outside. And to be able to go in and just fill yourself with sort of, you know, this very, you know, they look like little belly buttons or cowboy hats. They're like tortellini, but their sort of flavouring is slightly different. And then, you know, you just have lashings of sour cream and burnt butter and poppy seeds over the top of them. And so that's one of my favourite ones in it. And then the other one is probably there's a recipe that comes in the very beginning of the book for it, where Ava, it's the first recipe that Ava discovers that her mother has left her. And it's written for, you know, open this for when you are sad. And it's a lemon posset, which was a dessert that my grandmother is an English Stoic grandmother, was not an extraordinary cook, but she was very precise about what she did. She wanted to be a botanist. She would have been an extraordinary scientist, but she sort of applied that sort of that very critical thinking to everything that she did. And so the lemon possets was something that I found in a handwritten recipe book of hers that I inherited when she passed away, which was one of the inspirations for this sort of whole theme in the book. And it's just a very simple combination of like cream that's cooked and then whipped and then lemon juice, and then you allow it to set in the fridge, and the pectin from the lemon helps set the cream to a certain consistency, and then you take warm shortbread biscuits and you dunk them in the lemon posset for it. And it is just one of those things that if you're having a grey day, if you're having a sad day, if there are just like, you know, we talk at the end of the book about how sometimes the weather inside your head is just bad. You know, on the days when the weather in your head is bad, you know, the sunshine that comes from lemon possets and shortbread cookies is definitely something that will help break through the clouds.
Well, you've made me feel very hungry now.
Well, yes, maybe we should go and make a cup of tea and have some cookies.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me. It's been great talking to you and great to have you back again.
It's always a delight. Thank you, Jackie. And the other thing about the two books is that, you know, A Recipe for Family and Grace Under Pressure, while they are interlinked and interwoven to each other, you don't necessarily need to have read one to have read the other. But if you enjoyed Grace, then there's a good chance that you're going to enjoy A Recipe for Family. And if you enjoyed A Recipe for Family, you can then go back and read Grace Under Pressure and see how the two worlds connect with each other and maybe get a bit more out of it.
Yeah, very true. And just want to thank everyone who joined in and the great questions that people asked as well.
Thank you.
So thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you later. Bye.